From not being able to tell who was a patient and who was a doctor, to some utterly unnerving treatments, these asylum secrets will disturb you. Up first is involuntary commitment. Mental asylums were the exact opposite of what the vast majority of mentally ill people actually needed. But what if you aren't even mentally ill? During the 19th century, involuntary commitment to an asylum was a common threat and was carried out constantly. Mostly by patriarchs who were unhappy with their children misbehaving, or their wives not being the perfect silent wallflowers they were supposed to be, they would forcibly commit their family to the asylum, or threaten to gain good behavior. Because if you were committed, that was considered as good as a guilty charge, regardless of any associated mental illness even being real or not. Oftentimes, your father or husband's word alone was more than enough to have someone committed for life, which leads to the next disturbing issue of proving your wellness. Once committed, a patient's only goal was to prove they were well enough or sane enough to re-enter society. But when you're in a place as awful as a Victorian era asylum, what in the world could actually be considered healthy behavior? Most would say acting normally, not lashing out, being a calm, well-adjusted, rational person. But is that normal behavior for a person being denied their very human rights and bodily autonomy, who's forcibly removed from any sense of privacy, control, or ownership of their own life? Most rational and sane people would break down in such horrific circumstances. So is the person having the breakdown, or the person sitting calmly in the corner, the sane one? How do you prove your sanity when the very people responsible for determining your sanity are financially encouraged to find you insane? In these horrific circumstances, it's actually much more likely that psychopaths and sociopaths, who can better control their emotions and manipulate others, are much more likely to be released than an actual sane person. In order to prove their sanity, patients had to become adept at understanding exactly what the doctors wanted to see, and then performing to their expectation regardless of their own feelings. It should be unsurprising that this led not only to massive self-slaughter rates after release, but also that survivors had a very difficult time reintegrating into society because they had no sense of self-sufficiency and had effectively broken themselves to fit within someone else's mold. Speaking of issues reintegrating, the next is privacy paranoia. One of the first things asylums stripped their inmates of was their dignity and their clothing, and this would never be given back. Privacy was never once a concern for the mentally ill and not ill people being treated in the asylum. Personal privacy, the right to not be stripped and manhandled in public, did not exist. Many asylums considered bathing to be a treatment, and therefore not something people could be left to do alone. They would be forcibly stripped and bathed in groups of a dozen or more at a time. Even worse, however, is that asylums were often turned into for-profit zoos, with non-committed people being allowed to walk throughout the asylum's grounds, watching and gawking at patients, treatments, and more. Worse still, there was no sense of medical privacy either, and medical records, conditions, and more could be released to any member of the public at any time for any reason, which usually destroyed any chance of a career or life outside of the asylum, as no one would employ or associate with an ex-asylum inmate. Next are mandated diets. Many asylums also considered food to be paramount in the treatment process, just most of them went the completely wrong direction. Many places believed that bland food was mentally helpful, that spice, sweetness, or any flavor could excite the brain and cause more insanity. Other places decided that an abundance of any food at all was detrimental, and rotten butter, bread, and prunes were the only foods provided for every meal. Other places were a little better, deciding a healthy diet of veggies was for the best. Of course, the inmates had to grow these veggies themselves. On one hand, this could be a great practical therapy. Interacting with growing things is a great way to de-stress and mentally heal. That is so long as it was treated as a therapy and not slave labor, which it seems a lot of asylums use their inmates for. Next is nighttime chaos. The sleeping conditions of asylums were utterly horrific. It wasn't uncommon for 10 people to sleep in a room together with just about 6 feet of sleeping space. Every door would be locked for safety, despite that being the leading cause of numerous asylum inmates perishing in fires. Worse still, there were many genuinely mentally ill or mentally shattered people who screamed and raved the night through. Often, in the far from soundproof asylums, these screamers would end up feeding off of each other, leading to nightly chaos and horror as screams and babbling echoed down the halls. However, despite the inmates ostensibly being locked up, many of the more unhinged or dangerous ones would get out at night and sneak into other rooms. Sometimes these people were delusional but relatively undangerous, but sometimes they were highly aggressive. Well, we all know that severe sleep deprivation, as certainly caused by such a terrifying environment, does really good things to your brain and actually makes you more sane. Well, except of course not. Sleep deprivation is mentally devastating to anyone, mentally ill or not. The real question though is who runs the show? In a place filled with people who potentially cannot tell the difference between reality and delusion, it would seem pretty reasonable to expect that there would be clear clothing that indicates who works at the asylum and who is actually an inmate. But nope, asylum workers rarely wore uniforms that distinguished them, meaning that often inmates could and would exploit other inmates by pretending to be guards. Sometimes even the staff were fooled by particularly charismatic inmates. Next is overcrowding. Much like prisons today, there was a financial incentive for asylum owners to incarcerate as many people as possible for as long a time as possible. They would be put to work and their grateful families would continue to pay for treatment. So while the exterior facade of these asylums was often immaculately crafted and beautiful, the interior conditions were often cramped, unsanitary, and generally horrific. In some places, inmates slept in bunks 3 tall without enough space for every occupant to be standing or walking at once. Overcrowding to this degree is considered nowadays to be significantly damaging to mental health. Who would have thought? Next are forced treatments. It's not really surprising that asylum inmates would have treatments forced upon them, and on one hand this seems rational. A sick person often does not know what they need and may not want what will help them, except that's assuming that what the other party wants to do is actually what the patient needs and will actually help. Most treatments were just horrific and not helpful in the least, but one of the worst was the treatment of syphilis, an easily treatable condition nowadays. At the time, syphilis was highly lethal. Syphilis also causes, in its later stages, severe mental impairments and can cause insanity. So how did doctors treat inmates with syphilis? The most rational and science-based methods only, of course, by forcibly infecting them with malaria. It should surprise no one that having both syphilis and malaria is really not very good for your body at all. Speaking of treatments, the unique treatments used in asylums were horrible, on the verge or sometimes straying into outright punishment for no discernible reason. Many people at the time thought mental illness, especially more extreme forms like psychosis, needed the equivalent of a strong slap to bring someone back to their senses. So what's more painful than a slap? Why, a nearly molten piece of metal being forced into you, of course. Or, if that doesn't work, maybe we need a centrifuge to spin the evil out of you, and we'll put you on a massive wheel and spin this wheel until you're too dizzy to, contain yourself. There were a lot of really horrific treatments that we look at today and wonder, were any of these people actually insane, or were they just mentally broken by weeks or years of maltreatment and harm? And finally is asylum tourism. Asylums became the huge craze of the 18 and 1900s, so much so that they spawned their own brand of tourism. This tourism took a lot of forms, with its most banal and harmless being people walking about the grounds of the asylum to enjoy its beauty. But it rapidly became more toxic as people began to pay money to watch treatments, such as the aforementioned ones, or even lobotomies, washings, and electroshock treatments. The allegedly mentally ill would be treated as zoo animals, mocked and forced to entertain for people who disdained them so much they hardly even thought of them as human. Yeah, that would totally cure my depression. Why didn't I ever think about being treated like an animal on display with no human rights? That would solve all of my mental issues. Those were hidden evils, the disturbing secrets of Victorian asylums. I hope you learned something, and I'll see you next time.